It's my pleasure to welcome you all in this session, the first session in the second day for the workshop for Prince Mqren Scientific Chair on Crisis and Disaster Management. This session is really a very distinguished session where we have very renowned speakers from all over the world. We have a speaker from United States, from France, and from Slovakia. And they are very distinguished in their fields, and hopefully we can have a very warm and very fruitful information, knowledge, and discussion. I will introduce our first speaker. He is Dr. Doset Zobka. Dr. Zobka, he is a university professor and lecturer in crisis and disaster risk management at University of Geneva, Switzerland, University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and European academic in Berlin, Germany. At the same time, he acts as a senior international expert of UNIDP and United Nations Development Programme and European Union in the same field. He worked for 25 years in the United Nations Disaster Management System and several management positions, mainly in the United Nations OCHA. He was working as head of United Nations Disaster Risk Management Project in several countries affected by natural disaster, technological emergencies, and armed conflict in 4 continents, and carried out field missions to crisis situations on behalf of the United Nations to some 60 countries around the globe. He was also involved in disaster risk management activities in the Gulf region, especially in Abu Dhabi and Kuwait. He holds a Master in International Economics and Development and made postgraduate studies in disaster risk management and disaster preparedness center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. We welcome Dr. Dosen Zobka, and we open the floor for him, and we hope that he can have 20 minutes for presentation, and then we can have 10 minutes for discussion. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Salam alaikum. Thank you very much to the King Abdulaziz University and namely to the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Administration, Mr. Ayman, for inviting me to this very important conference. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope that I will contribute with some useful presentation. So what I will be talking about are major civil protection and disaster management systems which are run by the European Union or European Commission and by the United Nations system. This is what we would like to achieve this morning, to understand more about the main features, just because the time is limited, main features of European civil protection system. The same describe very briefly what arrangements are existing in the United Nations system for disaster management. Then I would spend most of my time on showing some very practical tools and services which mainly the United Nations system is offering to all member states, and of course the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia can also benefit from such services and tools. And at the end I will try to identify some useful lessons learned which could be applicable in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So, what is very important, all of us who are working in disaster and crisis management, we have to realize that the context of our work is changing. There are new trends, and you have to keep them in mind, and I outline a few of these trends on this slide. This density of population is rising. We have more mega cities, big cities, constructed very often in dangerous areas. Poverty is growing, increasing. We have more and more poor people, even in developed countries, even in European countries, even in the United States. It's not only a problem of developing countries. Climate change, we have been talking about it. Environmental degradation. And then globalization issues, explosion of food prices, etc., etc. All this has impact on humanitarian consequences, and who is dealing with humanitarian consequences of disaster and crisis? These are us, disaster managers. So very briefly, this is the evolution of the civil protection humanitarian aid system in European Union. The first step was creation of European Humanitarian Office, ECHO. You probably heard about it in '92. Then ECHO later on became the Directorate for Humanitarian Aid, and 2010 it was integrated with civil protection, which was also expression of very close link, which is very often forgotten, between disaster and crisis management and humanitarian management. These areas are very, very intimately linked. These are key elements of this European Union civil protection mechanism. There is balance between all phases of disaster management cycle. Response, preparedness, and part of response is also recovery. I didn't put it on the slide, and prevention. There is help to all European Union member states to increase their capacity for crisis and disaster management and ensure predictable and adequate assistance to the affected population. I focus mainly, very briefly, in two areas, on disaster preparedness and response in my presentation. So in preparedness area, there are traditional activities, exercises, training, exchange of expert projects. There is emergency response coordination center, operational 24 hours for seven days a week. There is voluntary pool of different expertise which can be requested by any of the member states and can be deployed to member states, but even to outside European Union on the request. And there is seed funding provided by European Union to member states on capacity development. Then there are specialized modules for disaster response. Different European Union member states are developing specific modules for different kinds of disasters, for flooding, for fires, search and rescue, medical, chemical, biological, radiological detection, water purification, etc., etc. And all these, when any member state of European Union needs such an assistance, it can ask another member states to help with this specific expertise. So this is the Emergency Response Coordination Center, which I was talking already about. How does it work in the practice? So when there is a request for assistance from any state countries which is hit, European Union member state country which is hit by disaster, it sends a message to ERCC, Emergency Response Coordination Center, and then Emergency Response Coordination Center is immediately contacted 32 civil protection contact points in member states and associated member states, and they can make offers of assistance needed for the affected country immediately. Now I will move to United Nations disaster management system. As you see, this is a very complicated map how it looks like in the international arena when it comes to major disaster and crisis. There are so many actors working on the spot. which are named on the right side of the slide, that the key issues is to ensure coordination. Coordination is really key. Without that, there could be duplication of assistance, gaps in assistance, etc., etc. And United Nations has very sophisticated coordination mechanisms, which consist of several committees, like Executive Committee of Humanitarian Affairs, Interagency Standing Committee. This is the key, really, Interagency Standing Committee, which is led by the head of UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, for which I have been working for 25 years. And this office has responsibility to coordinate all, not only UN agencies, but also NGOs, all international humanitarian and disaster management community which is responding to disasters. So as you see, it's not only on national level, as you have a coordination center in civil defense, it's also on the international scene. There is one small organization, UN OCHA, which is responsible to make sure that there is one strategy and that all these different agencies, actors go for the same aim, for the same objective. Then at the field level, there is a cluster coordination. Cluster means sectors. For each sector, there is health sector, agriculture, emergency telecommunication, etc., etc. There is one UN agency which is responsible for leading the sector, as you see. For health is World Health Organization. For protection, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, etc., etc. And all these sector leads, when country is affected, like for example, now we have civil strife in Syria. So they are bringing to the table in coordination and cooperation with the government all the players in the sector to be around the same table and to discuss what are the needs, what are the priorities, where we should go, in which direction. And as I already mentioned, who is responsible for coordinating all this big international machinery is so-called Emergency Relief Coordinator, which is United Nations Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, who is head of OCHA. Okay, I will move now to this practical side of the presentation. You see, this is the scene of big earthquake. You know what is interesting? Look, there are some buildings which were completely destroyed. And there are some very primitive, poor buildings which withstand the earthquake impact. This spot is from Armenia during the Soviet Union time. What was completely destroyed were modern buildings constructed during Soviet times because the building code was not respected. And what was not destroyed are the small buildings of pure people, because they were using knowledge from generation of generation how to construct small buildings like this which will resist the earthquake. So you see, this is the lessons learned, that sometimes we are constructing modern buildings which collapse completely, and all pure buildings are okay during major earthquake. So how it looks like when there is major disaster in some country. First, there is disaster impact. Then, if the government of the affected country needs assistance, international assistance, they have to declare a disaster and request for international assistance or donors, bilateral donors, multilateral donors, United Nations system, etc., etc. This is request for international assistance. Then, donors and UN is providing humanitarian financing to finance assistance for affected population. And then later on in a few weeks, transition programs start to make recovery and reconstruction. So these phases, these are life-saving phases at the beginning to save really lives. And then later we have alleviating of suffering of the affected population. And major activities which are taking place chronologically. First thing, to make damage assessment. What happened? What was the impact? Then, based on the impact, needs assessment. What are really the needs in food, in water, in shelter, in health of the affected population? And then, based on these needs assessment, some relief program or project should be established. And later on, we have recovery and reconstruction. And in the middle of this is coordination, because disaster risk management is multi-sectoral affair. There are so many players from different sectors. If you don't have strong coordination in one place, so there is a chaos and unnecessary loss of life and increased suffering. Some United Nations systems, tools and services which can be immediately deployed to the affected countries in the first hours after crisis. So we have crisis. First, who is doing first search and rescue are local rescue services. Then alert is sent by the UN through the system which is called Global Disaster Alert Coordination System, GDAX, known as GDAX. OCHA duty officer is sitting again as a duty officer in European Union. OCHA duty officer in Geneva is sitting 24 hours every day. He can receive immediately message from the affected government on this phone and starting to organize international assistance. And very often our flight from Geneva with assistance to the government is leaving in 3-4 hours. We have people on standby. We have plane who was provided to United Nations OCHA by Swiss government free of charge. So they just go to this plane and they go to the affected country to start assisting government in dealing with the disaster. Immediately, OSOC is established. It was already mentioned. On-site Operation and Coordination Center, where in real time all information is coming from all agencies involved in responding to disasters. UNDAC, United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team, is deployed to assist national government to coordinate international assistance. Operational Task Force is activated in Geneva. They are sitting representative of all major UN agencies, donors, non-governmental agencies who are providing assistance and discussing priorities and strategy. Situation reports are issued. Search and rescue team, urban search and rescue team can be deployed also by the UN to help national search and rescue authorities and mobilize search and rescue teams from different countries. And of course, what is important to deal with the media and to provide media with appropriate information. So these were services in first hours immediately. What is happening in first days after disaster? On-site coordination center is set up already in the affected country by the UN. In this OSOC, they are sitting UN coordination team with national government coordination team, and they are coordinating assistance to affected population. We have service which is making satellite imagery of disaster, UNOSAT, in the UN, and these pictures can be provided free of charge to the affected country if needed. Cluster system is activated. OCHA search and rescue staff is being deployed. This is staff which is on standby. It can be activated and deployed to the site. CERF is Central Emergency Response Fund, managed by UN, where we have $500 million available to be provided to the affected country to deal with the disaster. Environmental experts can be sent. Field mapping, we can assist government to do immediately field mapping of the situation. Emergency funding through different appeal systems can be ensured. And different support modules can be deployed. And also in UN OCHA there is small office which is dealing with civil-military coordination, because military are playing very important role in disaster management. It's very important to have a constant liaison between civil part and military part of disaster response to ensure really that they are working hand in hand. Usually, according to civil military guidelines, which are now approved international, always the leadership in these civil military operations should be with the civil authority, with the prime minister, president of the country, king in your case, or a minister at least. And then also model custom agreement for easy entry of humanitarian items to the affected country. First week, UN humanitarian depot based in Brindisi in Italy. We have relief items. It can be immediately loaded and sent to affected country by the plane. Standby partners can be activated. Central register is a register of all relief items which are available and can be sent. And financial tracking is taking place of all the contributions and assistance which was provided to the assistance to have overview what has been already provided and what is missing. Information management unit is set up on the side of disaster. They are working in the tent with very sophisticated technology. We are convening donor meetings in Geneva or in New York, where we are bringing requests from the government to the donor community to ensure that funding is provided to address the consequences of the disaster. And also if there is some environmental impact, environmental module and expert can be sent by the plane to the affected country. Okay, I went very briefly through it because I was told only 20 minutes. So I will move to the main conclusion, which I think, and good practices, which could be applied also in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and in Gulf Cooperation Council countries. First lessons learned, multi-sector partnership is very important and efficient in disaster and emergency assistance. This is not just issue of civil defense. Civil defense is coordinating body, but who needs to participate under coordination of civil defense is health sector, agricultural sector, economic sector, because we have economic losses, hospitals, fire service, etc., etc. Then there should be, for disaster and emergency management basis, very solid, strong legal and institutional basis to ensure that it's clear who is responsible for what, who has authority for what, that not unnecessary discussion or even competition starts during the disaster. Coordination, which I underline, is a key issue. And then what is important to have some adequate resources, time, expertise, and effort to be dedicated to preparedness action. If we want to be effective in responding to major crises and disaster, we have to prepare for it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zopka. Thank you very much, Dr. Zopka, for your interesting and very important lecture, summarizing it with the conclusions that could be applied at the GCC countries and Saudi Arabia. So we'll open the floor for discussion. If you have some questions, please raise your hands and we'll take some questions from the male side and then from the female side. So if there's mics, please, there's one person.
Assalamu alaikum. I have a question for Professor Zopka. Does he see a need for a central command for disaster? Because he mentioned so many units. And given this situation we passed through in the year 2008, we stayed about 2 days. We didn't know whether we should go back to our homes or stay in our guest houses. I felt that if we had a center with a quick response, the most important thing is the quick response. Because in 2 or 3 days' time, so many things happen. And I understand that was Hajj season, and everybody in the civil defense was at Hajj. But at the same time, if we had a central command center, they could, for instance, at least alert people not to come to this area. How do you see the situation, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good question and relevant question to this situation. Population should be informed immediately. Then it depends who is in charge of the emergency. If it is emergency, which is dealt with only by the, for example, city of Jeddah, I don't know how it is regulated by your legal system, but in European countries, it is the mayor of the city who is responsible. And he is convening or setting up emergency operation center, usually in his office, where there is high representative of the civil defense, of coordinating body, high representatives of all sectors, health sectors, firefighting, police, ambulances, etc., etc. They have to agree in very quick time, in 1 hour, couple of hours, evaluate the situation and send alert to the population immediately. And then it should be defined before the disaster what would be the means of alerting population through television channels, through radio, through SMS, etc., etc. But this should be done immediately in the first hours after disaster strikes.
Thank you. I think we'll take a question from here. Microphone, لو سمحت. Microphone.
لدراسة.
تفضل.
Thank you for your nice presentation. My question is, I know when the UN, you mentioned different organizations, but maybe 10 years or less, the UN, they established the ISDR to coordinate such events, disaster response. I didn't see the logo for the ISDR. Should be included as a coordinated body from UN side or international organizations or GFDR or the World Bank?
Very easy response to that. ISDR is not dealing with response. ISDR is not operational agency. ISDR is, I would say, public awareness raising and information management agency. But if there is major disaster, they are not going to the country. They are dealing with risk management and risk reduction and resilience. So they have no operational capacity as other UN agencies have, which can deploy all these services, on the planes. They don't have that. They are organizing seminars, workshops, conferences, but they are not really involved in providing assistance or response assistance or advising government, civil defense, how to strengthen preparedness systems. They are not doing that.
Thank you. We will allow some questions from the ladies section, please. If you have questions, I will come to you later. Do you have questions?
Good morning. No,
Morning.
thank you. Thank you.
All right. تفضل.
شكرا يا دكتور على المحاضرة القيمة. سؤالي: ما مدى استفادة الشرق الأوسط أو المملكة العربية السعودية
One moment. I have no translation.
دقيقة عشان يشوف الدنيا.
Yeah, please.
تفضل.
شكرا يا دكتور. ما مدى استفادة الشرق الأوسط أو المملكة العربية السعودية بالأخص من مكاتب الأمم المتحدة الخاصة بمجال الأزمات والكوارث.
What are the benefits that the Middle East countries getting from United Nations offices in terms of disasters?
Look, we would need, when we are talking about this, there are so many different sources of assistance that we would need probably 2 days. When I am making information about it, I need 2 days to go to the country and to prepare information. But you can get all these services which I went through. These are probably 30 different arrangements. You can get assistance in cash, in money. You can get assistance in relief items, food, water, health items, shelter. You can get expert in environmental problems when there is environmental pollution. You can get expert to advise on civil-military cooperation, how it should work, that it's smooth, etc., etc. There are so many different tools and services which can be deployed to the country in 24 hours. Sometimes, as I told you, the plane with experts is leaving in 4 hours in Geneva. They are on standby with their mobile phone and they are ready to get to the airport in 1-2 hours and to go to the country and to organize all this assistance.
Thank you. We have one more question. لو سمحت الميكروفون بس.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. The good presentation we have. I think we have an overview for what's going on in the whole world. That please ask to see that kind of coordination in the whole world. Regarding the political issues, that affected country have the war regarding who should supposed to come and who not supposed to come and what is there, because a lot of things regarding politics, who's the final word, who would go there, to give the assistance to the affected country. Thank you.
Very delicate question. As I mentioned, disaster management, crisis management, and providing humanitarian assistance are very much linked. But when it comes to humanitarian assistance, there are humanitarian principles like neutrality, independence. You have to assist no political consideration, no religious consideration. When there are affected people, you have to assist them. These are very nice principles which are promoted by Red Crescent and Red Cross movement, but from my experience, they are not respected all the time. That's a big problem. Very often, political consideration prevail, and this is very bad. We are going in wrong direction, because when it comes assist people who are affected by disaster, this political consideration should be forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zubka. Now we will move to our second speaker for this session. He is Dr. Thomas Robertson. He came all the way from the United States. Dr. Robertson directs North America operations of the International Emergency Management Society, where he founded the Teams USA local chapter. He's also a technical manager for team in the European Union Asset Program, which is a developing, improving participatory approaches to pandemic response. He is also leading the team's initiative discussing disaster resilience establishment in vulnerable societies. Tom is a founder and principal of Thinking Team, an international consultancy to leaders and organizations seeking high-performance teams dealing with complexity, uncertainty, and risk. Tom earned a PhD in electrical engineering from Purdue University, where he did research in bioengineering, communications, and artificial intelligence. He will speak about a very interesting topic, use of virtual simulation for emergency preparedness.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm very pleased to be here, an opportunity made possible by the Prince Megrin Chair Organization, the university, and the organizers of the conference. Thank you very much. I feel privileged to be speaking on the second day because I enjoyed very much the proceedings yesterday, where I benefited a lot from the wisdom and experience of my Saudi hosts. And in addition, it's always more comfortable to speak in front of a group that has been so warmly hospitable to my visit. I appreciate that. My background in nature is engineering, and through my experience in leading teams and companies, I've come to be interested in the interaction between technology and organizations in trying to solve problems, and have become an independent consultant. And I'm very pleased to have been, over the past 2 years, working in the emergency management field with teams to help make the world a safer place, being more resilient to emergencies. Today I'm going to be speaking about technology that holds much promise to help with emergency preparedness, virtual simulation. My intent is that this discussion will provide a framework to help think about the possibilities of this technology and begin a discussion to consider how it might be used to meet the objectives of the Prince Megrin Chair. I'll be speaking of some abstract concepts as well as some specific examples. And as I mentioned, the intent here is, in a relatively brief amount of time, to set up a framework that will help us all talk about how we might move forward to the benefit of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Preparedness involves a number of things, procedures, organizations, equipment, but a key component of that is the preparedness of the people. And I want to talk about that part of preparedness primarily in terms of two groups of people, two major groups of people. Professional responders, obviously important in handling an emergency, but also the general public, because it's important that they're prepared as well. First, I want to talk about the general requirements for preparedness when it comes to both the general public and professional responders. Then I want to talk about simulation, and in particular virtual simulation. I want to talk about it in a way that provides a framework to explain how different kinds of simulations help emergency preparedness. And I want to talk about some examples and challenges in adopting this technology, and then I'll conclude. First, let's consider the professional responder and the needs of what does it take for a professional responder to be prepared for emergencies in a general sense. Obviously, there's a wide range of comprehensive and specialized knowledge that's required. The professional responder needs to use a variety of special equipment. They need to be familiar with procedures. Beyond that very specific knowledge, they need to be prepared to function well in often stressful situations. And they're often find themselves during an emergency in the midst of very complex coordination situations, and they're working as part of teams. Another factor in the professional response to emergencies is interactions with the public. I'm talking about professional responders and the public as two different groups, but their interaction is obviously very important. And this interaction includes being sensitive to particular populations and their vulnerabilities, social attitudes and contexts that may apply in trying to implement directives and procedures. And something that Harold mentioned yesterday, Harold Drager, participatory governance, the idea of when do you engage the public? Is it only during an emergency, or are there opportunities to engage them earlier in the preparedness process itself? And there are certainly indications that there can be great benefit there. Now, in contrast to professional responders, the public needs to be ready as well, but their needs are somewhat different. They don't have so much the need for the professional knowledge of the professional responders, but they need to be motivated to prepare. Often the experience of emergencies is so rare that it's hard to get the general public to pay attention and do things we'd like them to do, for example, to have emergency preparedness kits or plans, or consider in their own neighborhoods how they would respond. Another issue is that, like the professional responders, it's desirable that the public be prepared to handle the stress, not panic. And that can be quite a challenge because they're even less exposed to emergencies than professionals are, generally speaking. It's also clear that successful emergency response is heavily dependent on community cooperation. And a lot can be done to establish that groundwork before emergencies, and that's clearly important. And also, the general public needs to know what to expect from the professional responders. That's their side of the interaction. Now, considering the needs of these two groups, what are the special challenges? And I think that in considering moving forward potentially with this technology here, it's important to say where are our special challenges. But in general, the challenges with professional responders are getting them up to speed on the knowledge required, specialized knowledge. There's a lot to learn. Often there is expensive equipment that may not be accessible all the time that it's important the responders be familiar with. Also, disasters are usually rare events, and so there's experience that's important, and often there's a limited opportunity to gain that experience, especially for new people on the responder team. And the complexity of response to an emergency in terms of dealing with the multiple organizations involved, the large numbers of people, extended geographic areas, the large crowds of something like the Hajj pilgrimage, these are very difficult to learn. On the other side, citizens, the general public, particular problems in getting them prepared are they may have insufficient interest. Even if information is made available to them, they may not take advantage of it. They certainly will not generally have the knowledge of important procedures and even what may be coming their way. I mentioned before the challenge of having the ideal preparedness, and they certainly have, the public generally has a small opportunity to practice. All this can lead to a public that can be easily overwhelmed by an emergency, which can just make response worse. Let me speak now generally about simulation. Simulation is a term I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and I'm using it in a very broad sense. Simulation can involve people going through a scripted exercise, or it can involve a computer. It, in general, is an abstract representation of reality that serves the value of being a basis for practice and learning. A particular simulation is defined by a scope, a boundary. How much is it trying to represent? And in actually designing a specific simulation for a particular purpose, it becomes very relevant to get that part right. What things do we need to represent? How accurate can it be? Because there's a cost trade-off there. Now, virtual simulation is a particular type of simulation that includes a virtual computer-generated representation of reality that creates a more realistic environment. Virtual simulation has been around for quite a while. One of the early applications was in the US military, where work was done that showed that people who were trying to train as a platoon of soldiers and had reasonably, and back in the days when this was originally done, they're pretty crude graphics on terminals, distributed, sharing a common virtual reality. Now, this sort of thing is very common these days with large player video games. Back when this was investigated by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, it was relatively new. But these environments can be very powerful in providing experiences that can be surprisingly realistic. So with these kind of simulations, there are some primary advantages. One is that you can practice dangerous situations with much reduced cost and danger. And in emergency, for example, one can imagine how challenging it would be to simulate or to actually do a live practice of a Hajj pilgrimage. I mean, that would be extremely expensive and difficult. Simulations allow you to play out alternate realities, which is very helpful in predicting and planning. And very often, it provides a good way to get a handle on complicated interactions that are hard to predict, but you can run simulations many times and get an idea of what the potential outcomes would be. So I'm going to switch to looking at simulation from a different lens, and that is in terms of different kinds of learning that it can enable. And I want to illustrate each one of these by referring to something we were talking about yesterday, which is the Hajj pilgrimage and preparing for the sorts of emergencies that can happen there. The first kind of knowledge that's important to preparedness here is what I'm calling explicit knowledge or automated book learning. And this is the kind, for example, in the Hajj pilgrimage, there are all kinds of procedures. There are specialized pieces of equipment. There are routes. There's a large body of knowledge to learn. All that information can be captured in documents, but very often a computer-based representation, perhaps with graphical simulation, can be an easier way to convey that. The second type of knowledge that's important to handling an emergency is experiential knowledge. This is the kind of thing that you can't get from books. And it's because even though I may be familiar with the procedures, the routes, the approach in general, I'm not prepared to use those in all the kinds of situations that come up until I actually encounter those. So that kind of experiential learning is important, and clearly with so many people and so large a group as the Hajj pilgrimage, it's hard to get experience with that, especially since it happens relatively infrequently. And so simulation can provide that broader base of learning. The third kind of learning is I'm calling psychological acclimation, and this is fighting the problem that any of us, when we're faced with an emergency, can sometimes respond in a degraded way because we're panicking. And who wouldn't be panicked with very large crowds starting to panic themselves. That's a very stressful situation. And if someone can get more experience with that in a safe environment and a sufficiently realistic simulation, that could make them better able to handle the real thing when it comes. Team building, that's another kind of learning that's required that has general components on how do we interact as a team, how do we share the work, and also on a personal level, getting to know the people that are going to be important to me as I carry out my assignment and we work together. And clearly handling and managing something as large as the Hajj pilgrimage is a tremendous teamwork challenge. And it's also a complex situation. What that means is that there are many moving parts, many organizations, many elements that interact, and that can be very difficult to learn, and simulations can help that because the elements can be simulated. You can play out multiple different types of outcomes. So how can, in general, there are a number of benefits to consider. Simulations can be less expensive and disruptive than real-time drills. A much wider range of experiences can be provided. In terms of, you can observe what happens during the simulated training session, identify the weak spots, and then tailor subsequent trainings to focus on those. You're able to get instant feedback on trainees and help them adapt to get better. And in addition, simulations can often be tailored to an individual's schedule. It's possible, certainly with networking, to coordinate across multiple locations so that people who want to practice working together don't necessarily have to be co-located. They can be sharing a virtual simulated environment in different geographic locations. And after going through, let's say, a simulation of the Hajj pilgrimage, the information is recorded, the performance is recorded. You can step back and learn from that. Quickly, I'll go through a few examples that illustrate these different types of learning and some of the things that have been done in the past. This is an example of a virtual terrorism response academy that was developed at Dartmouth College. And the idea here is that you sit at a computer screen and you have virtual manuals, you have virtual instruments that you can manipulate on the screen and thereby learn how to use them. This is an example of explicit knowledge that could be learned from a book, but learned more efficiently in a virtual environment. We're all familiar with driving simulators. Driving is an experiential type of learning, and this can be useful, and in fact there are specialized driving simulators that are specifically focused on emergency vehicles. This is a virtual simulation for a medical professional that allows someone through a computer-generated image in goggles and computer-generated feeling in fingers to allow a medical professional to work with a simulated casualty and respond to the symptoms of the person. This I'm using as an example of psychological acclimation because this is realistic enough that the medical professional will feel the urgency of saving this person and will also be able to experience the feeling of, I'm losing this person, I need to do something different. Here's an example of training that engages people in group work. This is a Hydra training, and this is a particular scenario that involves an aircraft emergency, a collision. New York City has a very extensive simulation that allows people in emergency command and control to be able to deal with the very complex elements of New York City, much like you would find in a very large event like the Hajj pilgrimage. People use smartphones all the time, and this is a particular app for a smartphone that helps medical professionals learn triage, which is the immediate response to casualties. Let me just briefly say that beyond training of the specialized skills professionals need, simulation can also benefit the public. And this can address the challenges I mentioned earlier about getting awareness raised and motivation to take action to prepare. And this can be done through simulations that are interesting, entertaining, and so forth. And they can provide practice and motivate the public to be better prepared. This is an example of a simulation in Walt Disney World of a storm emergencies. Here's a physical earthquake simulator in Zurich. Here's another storm simulator that uses immersive video and not much more. It's only visual, but it's very compelling. Online games have been developed by both the UN and the US Federal Emergency Management Agency to help even young children become aware of and better prepared. Simulation can be challenging to adopt. Sometimes organizations within the US, for example, get concerned about the cost effectiveness of doing it. And I think really the answer to this is for a group that may be considering it to look at where their weak spots are, where they know they need to be better prepared, and then design simulation around that. It's true that simulations can only be so realistic and they will never replace real-life exercises. And of course, there's some such simulations where power may not be available and so forth. Some situations where simulations cannot be used. They do require a certain amount of equipment. In conclusion, simulation has the potential to enhance preparedness of both professionals and the public. The professionals can get the skills they need faster, and they can learn to practice together and get a better handle on the complexity of the situations they deal with. The public can become better aware, more engaged, and more likely to be ready. And there have been advances in the recent years that makes all this technically more feasible because of graphics, social media, the fact that computers and computer screens are so widely available. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robertson, for your very interesting and very valuable information and very well-structured presentation. So we'll open the floor for discussion. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
As you know, the Hajj occasion you mentioned is crowd management. Crowd management it requires a lot of consideration, especially when it is extended over 4 or 5 days. The people want to complete the ceremony until they finish Hajj. Now, so if we had a situation where we have biological warfare, small anthrax or Ebola or what have you, should we inform the public beforehand or when the situation occurs? Thank you.
I think that in general, the experience in situations I've seen is that in an informed public, even of news that may be somewhat frightening or they don't want to hear, is very important because not only will they be better prepared, But we found the public very rapidly loses trust in the authorities that are trying to manage them if they feel they are not getting complete information.
في الأخ اللي موجود. ميكروفون.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. شكرا سعادة الدكتور على هذا الشرح الجيد والطيب. لدي سؤال، ماذا دوركم اتجاه الدول النائية من ناحية التطبيقات؟ هل هي تطبيقات تستعد لمقدور الدول النائية أن تأخذ هذه التطبيقات التي أنا أشعر أنها غالية جدا ومكلفة على بعض الدول التي تواجه الأزمات والكوارث؟ شكرا لكم.
Yes, I did. Yes, that's a very good question, and some of the simulation technology I mentioned is expensive. However, there is increasing availability even in developing countries of cell phones and other devices with communication and computing capability that I think can be used to advantage. For example, a local team may engage in a less automated simulation, but use social media and cell phones only to create a better practice than would be possible without that technology.
شكرا. الأخوات عندهم أسئلة؟ في أحد عنده سؤال؟
Yes.
تفضلي.
Please.
السلام عليكم.
السلام.
شكرا على العرض. ما مدى يعني محاكاة الواقع ودورها في التخطيط لإدارة الأزمات والحد من وقوع الحوادث أو الوصول إلى مستوى عالي من الخسائر
Yes, realism is an important consideration in any simulation. However, simulation does not need to be 100% realistic to be very effective. Two reasons for that. One is that often what you want to train or to learn is how to react to the unexpected situation. And even if the simulated situation is not the same one that a person actually encounters later, they will be better prepared for having experienced the simulation. However, your question is a very good question, and any time a simulation is developed, it is an important decision how realistic to make it, because more realism equals more expense. And it's impossible to make it 100% realistic.
That drives me to a question really. How effective is the simulation in disaster management?
You know, and that is another excellent question. There is relatively little quantitative evidence in the effectiveness. What I've been able to find most quantified is U.S. military studies that have made estimates of the billions of dollars that could be saved in simulation over live exercises, which, as you might imagine, would be very expensive using real aircraft and that sort of thing. However, I think that because it is so difficult, I think there's two ways to go forward. One is doing pilot projects to research, to try to get a better handle on the effectiveness might be a very useful thing for the Prince Megrin Chair to consider that would help guide the use of this technology, because it has a lot of promise. The other is to drive it from the other direction and say, where do we know we're falling down? Where do we know we're in trouble? And say, all right, let's use simulation to the extent we can to at least get better in that direction.
في أسئلة برضو عند الأخوات؟
شكرا جزيلا. Thank you very much.
في أسئلة عندكم يا شباب؟ الأخ اللي في النص تفضل. ميكروفون بس. ميكروفون للأخ اللي في النص الله يسلمك.
شكرا دكتور على العرض. نعلم جميعا أن السيموليشن أو المحاكاة أول ما بدأ بها هي لحلول للحركة المرورية في المدن المكتظة. ونعلم جميعا أنه بنيت السوفت وير على أسس وإكويجنز يتم العمل بها ويتم إعطاءنا توصيات لحلول هذه الحركة وإيجاد مخارج للخروج من الأزمات هذه. بالنسبة للسيموليشن في موضوع الأزمات، هل هي بنيت على معادلات يتم الاستفادة منها في الأوتبوت أو في المخرجات التي إذا وضعت هذه الفرضيات أو هذه المحاكاة، وهل يتم تعديل على هذه الفرضيات بحيث نستفيد منها في الواقع؟ شكرا.
There are several ways to approach a simulation. I think earlier in the conference we saw some examples of equations used to simulate flooding. And similarly, traffic analysis can use analytical methods, equations, can use discrete event simulation, which is not based on equations, but instead models that move forward. And a challenge with any simulation is calibrating it. And so, again, I will say that it will be important to study the realism of simulations. However, in training, in preparedness, it's more important that it's less important that the traffic flow that is simulated is exactly what will happen, and more important that it is representative of the level of complexity and surprise that the emergency responders need to deal with. And that will have a training value, even if, it's going to be impossible to predict with 100% accuracy something as complicated as, 3 million people going all over the place.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lekkersi. We will move now to the third speaker. You have to bear with me, really. I'm trying to squeeze the session, but we started late, about 20 minutes, and I squeezed the speakers for 20 minutes too. So you just bear with me for the third speaker, inshallah. Our third speaker is Dr. Doris Gillis. He came all the way from France. He has a doctorate in pharmacy, a master in industrial safety and environment, issued by the conference Des Grandes Écoles, a master's degree in chemistry and environmental health from University of Marseille, a PhD, doctorate of science in chemistry, environment and health and habilitation research at the University Jean Monnet. He conducted many research in the field of risk management, mainly related to risk analysis, evaluation of the consequences of the technological disasters, natural disasters, mitigation means, and crisis. So we'll give you 20 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to thank you, the Prince Mqrene Chair, for the invitation. I would like also to thank about the local organizers. It was a great pleasure and great honor to be there. Thank you again. So my background is professor, full professor at École des Mines d'Alès since 20 years, but I'm also fireman officer since 20 years as volunteer. So my brain is separated into a scientific part and a practitioner part. And my presentation will show this double brain. So my presentation will be divided in 3 separated parts. I will speak a few seconds about the crisis and disaster in order to introduce what are the main constraints, the main challenges in terms of field hospital. And I will finish by some potential improvement in this very crucial part of the emergency management, which is the medical management. So we all know that the crisis and the catastrophe belong to the emergency problematics. And since the beginning of the last century, we've got a significant increase of the number of crises. This curve is really interesting, that there is a significant increase of this number of crises. But what are the causes? The causes of this increase of emergency could be due also to the increase of telecommunications means. In fact, we think about that. Today, all the catastrophes are much more covered by media. So there are 2 steps, 2 potential explanations of this increase of crises and catastrophes. The crisis is different than a catastrophe. The catastrophic event is coming from the Greek overturn, and these terms is coming from the definition of the large consequences and great number of deaths. This last definition is very important. This great number of deaths or injured people defines appropriately the catastrophic event. In the literature, there are various definitions about disaster. It could be an event which are beyond the community response capacity. This is a real important keyword. In case of emergency, we have to deal with a community where the capacity, the response capacity is completely destroyed. We can also define a disaster as a sudden and massive imbalance between the quantity and also the related quality between the needs, which are obviously immediate, and the available resources. There are a lot of studies. I would like to underline the works from Quaranteli in this sociology of panics. It has been published in this journal in order to explain that the importance of this disequilibrium between the immediate needs and the available needs that would be a clear input as a definition of what is the disaster. Let's concentrate a few seconds on what is a disaster in terms of public health. again, if I concentrate my presentation on this point, there is the unable to support the victims in the traditional standards. I will concentrate in a few minutes on this, what are the traditional standards, but the obligation to establish a need for exceptional situation in the field of operation. This defines the challenges in terms of public health and disaster. We can separate the limited accident and disaster. When there are limited accidents, there are local resources that are sufficient. But when the disaster with overwhelmed needs, for which national and, for instance, in some cases, international needs are needed, you've got two consequences. The first is there is a temporary mismatch between the demand and the supply of care for the affected population. Second, and also it's really a key challenge, there are organizational challenges in terms of help of population, but also on coordination of people. Of course, in every country, there are a lot of emergency plans. The increase of humanitarian crisis is directly linked with this need of international collaboration. But in all countries, all field hospitals are more or less organized in the same process. The field hospitals are characterized by three phases. The first is a sleeping phase, where the challenges are in terms of management and logistics. But also, the field hospital in every country are also characterized by the difficulties of training due to the cost of real exercises, lack of trainees, and what has been said previously, the realism of the exercises. And all field hospitals everywhere in the world are also characterized by the difficulty to anticipate the precise location of the future catastrophes due to the fact that there are multiple scenarios. So there are health and basically health concerns, natural hazards, CBRN, technological, which determines some slight differences in terms of management. So therefore, the three challenges in terms of emergency plan linked with the use of field hospitals are how to optimize them in order to help decision to have a concrete and an effective actions. After this general presentation, what are the crises, what are the emergency problematics in terms of field hospital, I will concentrate on field hospitals themselves. So, the field hospital needs to follow the following advices. They must be in line with the national strategies. They must be coordination. They must be coordinated between public and private sector, which are key elements in every emergency. They must have modular implementation. This modularity is the key word. A field hospital must include preparation and training methods dedicated for this coordination action between medical persons, paramedics, and logistic persons. with different languages, with different strategies, with different words. They need to have general provision of all types of events. It must imply that they must prepare a lot of scenarios, a lot of plans. Last, they must be prepared on various provisions, for instance, various temperatures, various conditions of works, and so on. Again, these type of field hospitals must be linked with exercises. The exercises should be improved by the help of 3D visualization tools. This is the update, this is the evidence that we need 3D visualization tools. There are various types of health management in case of emergency. There is the Anglo-Saxon system where you've got the site of the emergency, you've got the nearest hospital, and you've got the help from hospital 1, 2, 3, and so on and so on. So the ambulance take the injured people, scoop and run. Scoop and run is the key word from medical care. There is no resuscitation phase, and they scoop and run to the hospital, and from this first one, there should be some transfer in terms of type of emergency, number of injured people, and so on. However, there is another system from the site. This French system creates an advanced medical point, and then they evacuate to 1 to 2 hospitals. So you've got the medicalization forward with a small water wheel, ambulances from the crisis to the advanced medical point, where they treat people with resuscitation phases. And afterwards, you've got this large water wheel that evacuate injured people to the hospital. My goal is not to say that the first system or the second system is good or bad. There are a lot of experts that has discussed in the previous decades on the advantage or the disadvantages. But the system is completely different in terms of strategy. Here you've got the advanced medical point with a small field hospital. So the field hospital intends to bring relief to many victims. It must provide emergency relief procedures implemented in order to remedy the consequences. It must have a dedicated head to determine the needs, for instance, the medical needs, the logistic needs, and so on, and it must be assigned to this mission. So these field hospitals can be used at the national level, but also exported in humanitarian phase. And this problematic is very important because it's extremely important as a national image to help foreign countries. After the description of what is the crisis, what are the basic rules or the basic elements of the field hospital, let's finish by what are the potential improvement of this field hospital. Why? Because today field hospitals are more or less the same as they were in the last century. It coming from the war medicine, but it's more or less the same concept, the same basis, without any improvement on scientific, organizational, logistics, or training point of view. So how to train people? Generally people generally remember 10% what they read, 20% what they hear, 30% what they see, and 90% what they do. So how to train people to field hospital with the use of field hospital, let's separate passive learning and active learning. In passive learning, you read, you hear, you view images and so on, you watch demonstration. Through training and, for instance, virtual training, you design, you perform a presentation, you do the real thing. People are able to define, describe, explain in this passive learning. They can demonstrate, apply in practice. In other words, in active learning, they can analyze, define, create, and evaluate. So this slide enhances the crucial need of training in field hospital. Because of the fact that exercises for the field hospitals are really, really difficult because of various reasons. The lack of immersion, the non-immersive situation, the low feeling of stress, the low mediatic pressure, the difficulties in mobilizing all sectors. During a field hospital training, the absence of the media pressure, the low stress is a clear disadvantage. Second experience that we had during our exercises, there is wrong consideration of needs due to the few absent study for identification of the real needs of participants. What the people said from the field, they consider that there are too much similarities between some exercises. So therefore it decreased the advantage, the potential advantage of these exercises. And I will finish this slide on what is really important according to me, is the lack of debriefing. My modest experience on various exercises is that in the end, who is able to say that we were bad in this and this and this? Generally speaking, people are more or less happy of what they did, and generally people, they don't want to blame each other. If you compare the exercises of the plane, the civil aviation tools, they train people to make a fault. In our exercise in the Civil Protection Agency, we never have this type of feeling to train people to make a fault. All exercises are generally built on a success, not on fault. So I consider that the use of virtual training for the use of field hospital is really important, because of the training objectives can be restricted at the operational level or at the strategic level. The strategic decision can be evaluated and studied based on decision theories. The real conditions are still not applicable. However, there are some immersion techniques that has been presented previously. Again, I come back to the need of a large number of evaluators. Evaluation of the virtual trainings in order to improve the debriefing is very, very important. I will finish by a project that we coordinate at the national level in order to improve what are the needs of field hospital. Again, we consider that, for instance, in this picture of a field hospital, after a study of the state of the art and also on the end user needs, we consider that there is a clear need of improvement in terms of organization and logistics, training, and safety for the personnel. So we aim to improve those three pillars by the use of RFID solutions, training based on 3D systems, and securing staff and effluent treatment. So, as a conclusion, I hope that in the next decade we will have future field hospital improvement. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Professor Gillis. If anybody has a question, we can have one or two questions. Here in the front row. Microphone also.
Thank you for your nice presentation. My question, can we introduce virtual reality in teaching environment? Like we have emergency management program as bachelor student. Can we cooperate, like to introduce virtual reality in teaching? Did you do this in your university?
The question is important. Of course, we plan to collaborate into these virtual reality systems, but before doing that, it's really important to analyze the needs and the appropriate needs of the potential end users of these systems. Second, to fine-tune and to define the appropriate scenario able to provide any solution. And third, to improve the effectiveness and the quality of the debriefing. It means that we must have separated persons, the trainees and the trainers, and the evaluators able to individualize potential improvement and able to provide the appropriate message to each level of hierarchy of the system.
الأخوات عندكم أسئلة؟
موجود سؤال.
تفضلي.
السلام عليكم. احنا اخذنا دورة عن الانعاش الرئوي. وعرفنا انه احنا كيف مو فقط في الجامعة على المستوى العام، يعني ممكن اني انا اقوم باي طريقة للانعاش الرئوي. نحتاج كمان دورة يأهلني انه مو فقط في الجامعة حتى في خارج انه كيف اقوم يعني اني اتخذ اي قرار في حال حدوث كارثة. زي ما هو ساير في قال الدكتور انه يحددوا شخص انه يكون مؤهل حتى لو كان دولي في المستشفيات.
فالسؤال يعني انت تطلبي انه تعطوا دورات في يعني في الامور الاخرى الثانيه المفروض يتهيأ لها الشخص على اساس انه يتعامل مع اي كارثه حتى لو كانت خارج الجامعه.
بالضبط هذا اللي اقصد.
ان شاء الله. ان شاء الله. في احد عنده اسئله ثانيه؟
في سؤال ثاني لو سمحت.
تفضل. تفضل يا اخي.
Hello, Professor. I would just like to ask you, like you have mentioned about virtual training. So how far this has been successful? And I mean, are we really getting good results regarding virtual training? Thank you.
It's a good question. Of course, real exercises are existing since a lot of decades. The measurement of the effectiveness of exercises, it's difficult to handle. There are various scientific publications that are discussing on that, but the problematic is here, how to measure the effectiveness of an exercise, even if it's a real exercise or a virtual exercise. Again, if I come back to this debriefing phase, there are some potential element of response. First of all, for practitioners at the official level, so I mean at the gold level, we made a little survey before the exercise, and we made the same survey after the end of the exercise in order to measure quantitative information in terms of improvement. And the answer was not sufficiently evident. It means that in some cases you've got an improvement of knowledge, in some cases you don't have any improvement of knowledge. So your question is really relevant. What do you train? What is your personal improvement in case of training? Moreover, if I come back to the first question, it's also very difficult for medical sector. Again, how to improve the knowledge of the doctor? How to measure the improvement of a knowledge from a medical point of view? It's cognitive science, but it's really difficult. Last but not least, in any emergency, we have to deal with information to the public. The challenge, the scientific challenge, is to measure if those exercises improve the capability to better communicate to the public. But what is a good communication to the public? There should be a lot of PhD thesis on this question.
Well, I think also she was intended to know what are the skills that she needs other than first aid to be successful outside the academic environment.
Again, it's a really important and a really relevant question. The skills are complex. Skills are, of course, pure science, engineering science, and human sciences. And again, dealing with field hospital implies that you will use a fourth dimension, is the health dimension. So, working with hospital medical doctors and engineers implies to determine a common language. In some cases, the definition of a catastrophe is not the same on an engineer point of view or on a medical point of view. So, communication is the key word. Communication is the basic skill between the practitioners, between the stakeholders, and with the public.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the organizing committee, I will thank our guest speakers today, Dr. Zobka, Dr. Robertson, and Dr. Gillis, for their very nice and important presentations. And they will be available throughout the day. If you have more questions, you can ask them questions. We will stop now for 15 minutes, for coffee break, 15 minutes, and they will come back for the second session. Dr. Nasser is going to present the lunch to the guest speakers.